Well, last week we started a new sermon series called Suitcase, and we're talking about the baggage that we carry around with us. And the reason that we're doing this is because we had talked about covenants, and we had talked about the ability to be happy in covenants. And one of the things that we need to cover as we move on, as you struggle to implement a life in a covenant with Jesus Christ, one of the things that we need to talk about is the fact that we have a tendency to take into our new covenant with Christ a lot of baggage from our other covenants, from our other parts of our life. We have a tendency to bring those with us. We have a tendency to understand just the way that Jesus expresses his life with us in the Word of God. We have a tendency to read into those terms things from our past. And it's important for us to understand that getting rid of a lot of this baggage is going to be helpful for us in living a fulfilled life with Jesus Christ. So we're going to be in Zechariah chapter 3 today, and we're going to be talking about guilt, because this is one of the big things that we carry with us. All of us have a tendency to do this. We may not recognize that we do, but the tendency that we all have is for us to bring into this new covenant relationship with Christ, to bring a lot of guilt. And this guilt can actually be incredibly destructive in our lives as we try to move forward with Jesus. So look, Zechariah chapter 3, we're going to read verses 1 through 7. And what's happening here is that there's this picture of Joshua, the high priest. Now, remember that in the Old Testament system, you had a guy who was high priest. And his job was very important. There was a lot of priests, and they would take turns doing different things in the temple. There was different duties that they had, and they would take turns doing that. But the high priest had a special job. There was a lot of aspects to that. One of the things was that when the high priest died and a new high priest took over, that people who were in cities of refuge could then go home. There's a lot of different parts to this. But one of the big things that the high priest did is on the Day of Atonement, he went into the Holy of Holies, and he sprinkled blood on the Ark of the Covenant. And it was really important for the people of Israel that he did this once a year. Now, you need a high priest in order to do this. And it's important also to remember that the high priest had special clothing, and he could not do his duties without that special clothing on. There was a sense in which that special clothing protected him from God, basically. He would walk into the presence of God, and if he didn't have this special clothing on, he wouldn't have that protection, so he couldn't do that. His clothing was incredibly important. So with that as background, let's look at Zechariah chapter 3, and it says, "Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. The Lord said to Satan, 'The Lord rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire?' Now Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The angel said to those who were standing before him, 'Take off his filthy clothes.' Then he said to Joshua, 'See, I have taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you.' Then I said, 'Put a clean turban on his head.' So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him, while the angel of the Lord stood by. The angel of the Lord gave this charge to Joshua, 'This is what the Lord Almighty says, if you will walk in obedience to me and keep my requirements, then you will govern my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you a place among these standing here.'" So it's an interesting passage for a number of reasons. The first one is that we have this picture of the high priest Joshua standing and having dirty clothes on, and Satan accusing him. Now, this is interesting. How many of you guys have ever had a dream where you were inappropriately dressed? Anybody ever have that dream? You're inappropriately dressed. Now, the interesting thing is psychologists will tell you what that dream means. It means that you are unprepared, right? You will especially find this if you have, let's say you have to go into a job interview, if you have a test going on. I had that dream a lot in high school. Before I would have a test the next day, I would have a dream that I showed up and I'm at school and I look down and I'm in my underwear. I think it was pretty embarrassing at the moment because it felt real, but The thing is that you have those dreams, and the psychologist will tell you it's because you feel unprepared, you feel inadequate. So the interesting thing is that clothing in the Bible is a picture of our identity. And so when the priest has clothes of glory and beauty, it's the picture of an identity that is full of glory, that's full of grandeur, that's full of excellence. And the interesting thing in the Bible is that a picture of dirty clothes is actually a picture of the antithesis of that. It's a picture of sin. It's a picture of not just being inadequate, but being dirty, having mistakes, having sin, having the opposite of glory and excellence and grandeur with you. And so Satan is standing there and he's accusing Joshua. Now here's the thing that's important to understand. Satan's accusations aren't false. But the other interesting thing is that basically Satan tempts us, leads us into getting dirty, and then he stands there with us before God saying, this person's dirty. That's the kind of person that Satan is. That's what he does. So the interesting thing here is that we have a situation where Joshua is experiencing guilt. But when Satan accuses us, we also have a tendency to experience shame, and we'll talk about the difference between those two things. And really what happens here is Joshua has his guilt and his shame removed, and he's able to do what he's supposed to do. If you read the rest of the chapter, what's told to Joshua is that you're going to be a symbol, you're going to be an image of someone who will come later. And so your job is really important. You need to go stand there, and you need to image this great person, this great high priest, this great king who's going to come after you. You need to image that, so you need to get about your job. So I have cleansed you. I have made your guilt and your sin go away so that you can do that. The reality of the situation is all of us have to deal with guilt. So we want to ask ourselves a few questions about this passage today so we can understand how to exist in this new covenant that we have with Jesus Christ in a way that deals with this guilt. So the first question we're going to ask is, what do clothes have to do with guilt? The second question we're going to ask is, what is the difference between accusation and conviction? And then the third question we're going to ask is, how do we change clothes? How do we actually do this? So what do clothes have to do with guilt? Guilt, is important to understand, is an awareness of actions that don't measure up to a standard. That's what it means to have guilt. And so guilt is about actions. It's about things that you can judge from the standpoint of, what did I do? It's pretty clear whether you're guilty or whether you're not guilty. And the issue here is that the clothing and the dirtiness of the clothing represent the fact that Joshua is a human being and he is guilty of sin. He has guilt in himself. Now, the difference between that and shame is important. Shame is an awareness of an identity that doesn't measure up. So guilt is about your actions, and shame is about who you are. Guilt is about your actions, and shame is about who you are. Now, here's the thing. One leads to the other. And the problem is that all of us feel this. Now, as we said, clothing in the Bible is identity focused. And so we go back to the garden and we see that when Adam and Eve sinned, what happened was their eyes were opened and they realized that they were inadequate. They realized their lack. They realized all of the places where they fall short. Here's the thing that's interesting. Think about it this way. Before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, before they ate that apple or whatever it was, pear, pomegranate. Pomegranates they're a mess. It could have been one of those, right? It could have been one of those. So here's the thing. Before they ate that, they trusted in God. And the thing that's interesting about this, it's very fascinating to think about this in the terms, theological terms, is before they ate, they had complete trust in God. They believed that God was on their side and for their good. And so here's the thing. You don't think about your own capabilities when you have somebody like God on your side. You don't. Why would you? Think about it this way. Let's say this. Let's say you're on a you decide to enter a 2-on-2 basketball tournament. And Michael Jordan at his prime is going to be your partner. Do you worry about brushing up on your skills? You don't, do you? You just say, it doesn't matter. Like, it literally does not matter. We are going to win the tournament. And it really, if I never touch the ball, we're going to win the tournament. So it really doesn't matter. So you don't have to give your skills. You don't have to give your ability. You don't have to give any of that very much thought at all. You don't have to put a second into thinking, am I adequate? Because the person that you're with, who is completely devoted to your good, who is completely on your side and completely available to you, has it all covered. You don't need to think about whether you're good at stuff or not. Now, here's what happens. The minute that they doubt that God is on their side, all of a sudden, their capabilities become the issue. If God is not on my side, all of a sudden, it really, really matters what I can do for myself. And so their eyes are open, and what do they realize? They realize they're completely inadequate. I had a weekend this weekend where I got to experience that. I was trying to change a ceiling tile in one of the rooms here in the church, and it took me over an hour to change one ceiling tile. Over an hour. And I thought to myself, if I did this for a living, this probably would have taken me 10 minutes. But instead, I broke a ceiling tile, had to cut another one, banged that one up pretty good, it was the smallest, tiniest space, and I ended up having to take part of the ceiling grid down in order to get it in, and then trying to replace it. Have you guys experienced that before? And when that happens, what do you say to yourself? You say, man, I'm just so terrible at stuff. I'm so terrible at stuff. Here's the reality of the situation. In the Bible, the idea behind this is really interesting. That guilt and shame can actually be crippling. And there's kind of an argument that could be made that this guilt and shame leads to death. In fact, I was reminded of a movie as I was studying for this week, and I was watching it this week. This movie is called The Edge. Has anybody seen it? The Edge, it has Alec Baldwin in it, and it's got Anthony Hopkins in it. And what happens is Anthony Hopkins, there's a few spoilers here. If you don't want it to be spoiled, just, fingers in the ears. Here's the deal. Anthony Hopkins is a billionaire. The problem is this. Even the fact that he's a billionaire doesn't solve for him the problem of guilt and shame. You see him at the beginning of the movie, and what happens is that he says he knows a lot of facts, but he really can't put them into any use in the real world. And he's constantly aware of his own shortcomings, and he's constantly questioning why people actually like him. Do people just like me for my money? He wonders, because he has a much younger wife who's a model, he wonders if she really loves him. He wonders if the people that he's with are going to remember that it's his birthday. He wonders all of the time, whether or not he's adequate, whether or not people really like him or just for his money, whether or not people really are on his side. All of these things are constantly there. He's constantly dealing with a problem of his adequacy, even though he's a billionaire. Now, what happens is they end up crashing in a plane, and it's interesting that there's a lot of theological themes in this movie. In fact, towards the beginning of the movie, he's eating an apple, and after that happens, he ends up going through this crisis where they crash in a plane and they're on their own. 3 of these guys are on their own in the middle of the wilderness, and he says something interesting. He says that he read a book that when people get lost in the wild and die, they die of shame. How did I get myself in this situation? Why did I do what I did? Why did I make the mistakes that I made? And throughout the movie, there's, interestingly enough, this idea of shame personified in this bear, this giant grizzly bear that ends up chasing them through the movie. And every time they make a mistake, this bear is there. And he eats one member of the party just straight out. And he's chasing the other ones, and they're in this position where they have to build a ring of fire now that this bear has the taste of human flesh. It won't stop. It's after them. And so they build this ring of fire around at night, and they decide, we're going to have to try to take this thing on. We're going to have to try to kill this bear. And I won't tell you what all happens in the movie. But the reality of the situation is people do die of shame. Because shame robs us of our joy. Shame robs us of our confidence to interact with people. Shame robs us of the ability to go out and find that better job, of the ability to become that better father or husband or wife or mother. Shame robs us of the ability to go out and live our lives. And what we end up doing is we end up dying a very, very slow and very, very agonizing death over the course of maybe 40 or 50 or 60 years. But we end up dying because of shame. And our life isn't taken away from us all at once. It's taken away from us a little bit by a little bit by a little bit. And you know what I'm talking about. Shame kills us. And the accuser is right there to hurl accusation at us. In fact, there's a point in the movie where one character is trying to kill another, and while he's trying to do it, he's hurling accusations. You're not what you think you are. Everybody can see right through you. It's interesting that when people go to kill other people, that's really what they have to do, isn't it? They have to say in their mind why that person deserves to die. They have to be the accuser. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, it's interesting that Scripture says this, "And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, 'Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before God.'" You notice that salvation and power and the kingdom of God and the authority of Christ come when the accuser is thrown down. Satan is a liar, Satan is an accuser, and Satan loves nothing better than to remind you of your guilt and to intensify your shame. But it's important to understand that God actually created guilt and shame, and God actually created Satan, and God actually allows him to do his work. And that's something that we have to struggle with, right? There's actually more to it than this. We might say to ourselves, well, let's just forget about guilt and shame. Let me convince myself that I'm not guilty. Let me convince myself that I should have no shame, and then everything will be great. And the problem is that actually doesn't work very well. In fact, it turns you into a bit of a psychopath. So we are stuck in this position where guilt and shame are killing us, and yet we find it absolutely necessary to deal with guilt and shame. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, why does God allow this? And the answer is actually pretty intriguing. Guilt and shame have to do with the existence of a value hierarchy, and you can't get rid of guilt and shame without getting rid of the value hierarchy that you depend on to live. Why do you experience guilt and shame? You experience guilt and shame because you don't live up to the value system that you know is real and that you depend on for your life. You can't experience joy or happiness or any kind of motivation without there being some kind of good thing to enjoy and to pursue. It has to be there. And so the problem that we experience as human beings is we can't live without this value system, and yet our inability to live up to it causes us to experience this guilt and shame, and Satan stands there accusing us, reminding us of it constantly. Now, here's the thing. You might say, well, guilt, I understand. Well, what about shame? Here's the problem. In our hearts, we all know this is true. Not only am I guilty of individual actions that are outside of what God desires of us, but we also know that in order to experience the love of other people, that we need to be worthy of that love. That there's a such thing as being lovable. There's a such thing as being lovable. And the problem is that we know that we need to be that for other people to love us, and yet we find that we struggle with that. Now, you might say, well, I don't know about being lovable, but we kind of do. We can picture people that really aren't lovable. Like, just imagine for yourself Hitler and saying to yourself, well, if I was his best friend, how would I handle that situation? Obviously, that's pretty extreme, but you get what I'm saying, right? You sit there and say, well, would I enjoy hanging out with him and expressing to him his redeeming qualities? Probably not. So we have this problem. Now, in order to understand this problem and why God allows this situation and why he even allows Satan to do his work, we have to know the difference between conviction and accusation. The Spirit's job is to convict us of sin, and Satan takes on himself the job of accusation. We have to understand that Satan's desire is to destroy us, but God's desire is to bring us life. And in that, we'll see that there's a reason for this situation that we live in. So let's look at number 2. What is the difference between accusation and conviction? Well, first of all, as we said, the Holy Spirit convicts us of sin, and Satan accuses us. And Satan, in his accusation, seeks to destroy us, while God seeks to save us. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is this dual nature of reality comes in over and over again in Scripture. Let me give you an example. You remember that there was a guy named Joseph, and he had some brothers that weren't too keen on him. Do you guys remember that? His brothers were kind of uninterested in his glory, so to speak. And so they decided to kill him, and then they revised that plan to let's sell him into slavery because there's money in that. And so they do that. They sell him into slavery. And remember that Joseph has a rough time of it. Ends up in prison, ends up accused of things. Things are not going well until one day, all of a sudden, through an interesting set of circumstances that God brings about, he's elevated into second in command of all of Egypt. And he gets a chance to see his brothers again and confront them on a few things. And in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, it says, "As for you," this is Joseph speaking, "as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Now here's the interesting thing. Satan wants to use guilt and shame to destroy you. That's his desire. That's his hope. And most of the time, he will succeed with most people. Most people will succumb to their guilt and shame at some point in their life. Now, here's the thing. God doesn't want guilt and shame to destroy you. God actually wants to convict you, and he wants to use the same kinds of things that Satan uses to destroy you. He wants to actually use that to save you. Now, let's see how that works. To understand this, you're going to have to find or look at 3 failed strategies that people use to deal with their shame and guilt. So strategy number 1 is the Pharisee. People will use this to deal with their shame and guilt. They'll become a Pharisee. What do we mean by that? You will strive incessantly for perfection. You'll say, okay, so I have guilt, I do things wrong, and I need to achieve lovableness. I need to achieve lovability, so what I'll do is I'll incessantly push myself to do this. I will incessantly push myself. I will get rid of every mistake I can possibly make. I will analyze everything that I do, and I will become worthy of these things. Now, this is what the Pharisees did. In fact, there were some Pharisees named the bruised and the bleeding. Have you guys ever heard of those guys? The bruised and the bleeding. They got to be bruised and bleeding because they were so concerned about looking at a woman lustfully that they would actually tie a fabric around their eyes. They would make a blindfold, tie it around their eyes, and then they would go walk through town doing their business that way. And they were called the bruised and the bleeding because, well, that's what happens when you try to walk through life with a blindfold on, right? It's not very easy. They wore these as marks of honor. It just made them annoying to normal people, right? So that's what happened. Now, there was the bruised and the bleeding. There were the ones that tithed all their spices. Here's the thing. You can kill yourself by striving for perfection, by being unrelenting. You can kill yourself doing this. And the problem is that what will usually happen as you strive for perfection, this will happen to you. The more you focus on being perfect, you know what happens? The more aware of your imperfection you become. You don't think this is true? Try one thing. Try dieting. Try dieting. What usually happens when you diet? You become more and more aware of your inability to resist temptation. You become more and more aware of all the things that you eat that you shouldn't have. You know what I'm talking about, right? If you've ever tried it, what you will discover is that try doing anything. You know, there are little, as a public speaker, I recognize there are little things that I do. You know, you say to yourself, you go, or something like that. You know what happens when you focus on that? You start realizing how many of those things that you actually do. I'm amazed that any of you can listen. Because I listen to myself, I watch myself on video, and I say to myself, holy cow, look at all, and if you try really hard to get rid of all those things in your speech, you will become aware of how many of them there actually are. How many of you have ever, when you were maybe a teenager, you said the word like all the time? And you started realizing it, or somebody pointed it out to you, and you said, oh, I'm going to change that. And then you started realizing how many times you use the word like constantly, like in every sentence, like you're just constantly like saying like. You know what I'm talking about, right? This is what happens when you're a Pharisee, is you will discover all of the things about yourself, and it's not a pathway to getting over this stuff. The second failed strategy is scapegoating. Now, here's what happens. Usually one leads to the other. You will find that you can't succeed by being a Pharisee, and so the second thing is you will start scapegoating. You'll start to accuse others of their failures. So what happens is your attention will go from your own failures and trying to fix those to other people's failures. It's so much more enjoyable. I don't know about you, but I find other people's failures much more enjoyable than mine. And so what happens is that you will start looking at everybody and all their failures, and you will start accusing them in their mind, out loud, to your friends, whatever you can do. It's like a drug, and there's never enough. And the problem is you can never cover over your own shame and guilt by pointing out the shame and guilt of somebody else. You can't do it. But it will become like a drug to you, and you will find that you will do it all the time. All the time. It will become an incessant thing that you can't stop yourself from doing. Now, here's the problem. Do you think that that's a good foundation for relationships? Like, is that the way to have successful relationships? Do you think that you can find people in the world enjoyable and engaging and all that kind of stuff while you're constantly fixated on all of their shortcomings and problems? You can't. You can't do it. And so it will destroy your relationships. You will become bitter. You will not have very many friends, if any, and you will find yourself alone. Because what you're really doing is you're killing others. Whether you're actually, obviously you don't physically kill them, but the issue is that you will so focus on the reasons why they aren't good enough that you will destroy their glory. And the third thing that happens, the third strategy, and this is what happens when we go down the road here, is we end up in the land of Eeyore. This is where you start dying of shame. Where you start realizing that you've tried and you cannot be lovable. You've tried and you cannot get rid of your shame and your guilt. You've realized that nothing is ever good enough, that no amount of effort is working. You've realized that by blaming other people, all you've done is made yourself actually a worse person. Others are blind to their faults, but you will see your own. And you will not be able to experience joy or be motivated because you cannot imagine the outcome of any activity being worthwhile. And honestly, there's a lot of people who this is how they end their lives. And I don't mean ending their lives by like suicide or anything like that. I mean just they live out the rest of their days in this place of being Eeyore. Of realizing that they can't do anything well enough, they can't really, why even try? Why even get started? Because it's not going to end up being of any value. And so they'll sit and they'll watch entertainment, and that's the way that they'll finish their lives. It's not the kind of life that we want, because it really isn't life at all. So thirdly, how do we change our clothes? God has created guilt and shame, and he's created Satan. So how do we use this the way that God intends for it to be used? So Joshua is being accused here. And the interesting thing is that when Joshua is accused, something amazing happens. God doesn't say, and this is the thing that we have to get to, God doesn't say, oh, Joshua, you're just fine the way you are. Don't listen to him. Like, that's the thing that we're tempted to do. And when people come to us, sometimes that's what we're tempted to do. Oh, it's fine. You're fine the way you are. It's okay. The problem is that the people, they know that it really isn't fine. And so they start not really trusting our judgment. That's not what happens here. Is Joshua isn't told, oh, you're fine. It says now in verse 3, now Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The angel said to those who were standing before him, take off his filthy clothes. Now what does Joshua have to do? He has to allow himself to have those filthy clothes taken off. Here's the thing. This is actually an interesting situation. What Joshua has to allow to be done is the fig leaves that are covering him. Just like in Adam and Eve's story, remember they put on fig leaves. They had to say, okay, here's the deal. In order to get this new thing put on, I have to allow God to take this off. What you have to do is you have to trust God enough to allow him to take all the things that you're pointing to as evidence of your worth that lie outside of who he is. You have to allow those to be taken off. Now here's the thing, this is actually harder than it sounds. And the reason is because we point to things to say, oh, I'm actually a really good person. I was watching this video online yesterday, and it was about this house, this $12 million house in Colorado that was, they tried to make it like the Biltmore estate. It was in Colorado, it's on like 39 acres. It's 21,000 square feet, so it's about the size of this church building. And only has 6 bedrooms in it, which is kind of insane. It's an amazing house. It's made out of limestone, not actually the fake stuff, the real stuff. Had it carved and everything. Built this house. Person spent 12 years building this house. 12 years. Lived in it for 3 months, and now they're selling it. You look at a house like this, and you say to yourself, well, at what point are you done? At what point do you say, hey, this is enough house for me? And it apparently goes on from there, because you guys have heard that we talked about that house in Bel Air called The One. That's $100 million. It's $500 million. It's over 100,000 square feet. It's got its own nightclub in it. Like, at what point, here's the thing, what happens is people use this stuff to say, oh, look, this shows that I'm a good person. This shows that I'm worthwhile. This shows, they point to an accomplishment. They point to, oh, I can do this thing or I can do that thing. The problem is, the reality of the situation is those things are never enough. That's why the $12 million house isn't enough. You have to go up from there to the $50 million house. And then you have to go up to the $75 million house. And then you have to go to the $100 million house. And then you have to go to the $500 million, right? There's always more. You have to allow yourself to have all those things that you point to as this shows that I'm worthwhile taken off. Why? Because in the end, you will find those things inadequate. The guy who says, well, I'm a professional baseball player, guess what? He's going to retire. He says, well, I've got the hitting record. Guess what? Somebody's going to break it. You say, oh, but I'm an expert in this field. You know what? Pretty soon that field is going to be completely moot because the technology and everything else will move on. Eventually the problem is that everything that you point to, something will come along and make it irrelevant. And you'll be telling stories about how you were the greatest thing at this, and some young person will go, I don't even know what that is. Have you experienced that yet? Nobody fixes Fetzer valves like I do. And they say, what's a Fetzer valve? And you say, it's all hydraulics these days, right? So here's the thing. eventually it will not be enough. And so you have to allow it to be taken off. Well, then what happens after that? Remember in verse 4 it says, the angel said to those who were standing before him, take off his filthy clothes. Then he said to Joshua, see, I have taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you. After you allow God to take off everything, then you allow him to dress you. And what you're really doing is you're allowing Christ and his glory and his goodness to count for you. You say, you know what, I don't have anything really worthwhile. I'm not a great person. I'm not an amazing person. I'm not lovable. I'm not any of these things. But you know who is? Christ. And Christ has given me everything that he has. Christ has given me everything that he has. We've been talking about covenants the last couple of weeks in our Sunday school class. And when you start understanding covenants, it's pretty amazing that what happens in a covenant is every single thing that's yours becomes the other person's, and every single thing that's theirs becomes yours. Guess what? You've given to Christ everything about you that is full of guilt and shame. All of those articles of clothing that weren't enough, every one of those things you've given to him. And guess what he's done? He's put on you the most amazing, the most glorious robes, and he's dressed you in them. And you say, you know what, it's not me, it's him. And then what happens, notice that he says after this, he says in verse 6, the angel of the Lord gave this charge to Joshua. This is what the Lord Almighty says, if you will walk in obedience to me and keep my requirements, then you will govern my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you a place among these standing here. He says, you know what, now that I've changed the garments, now that I put these amazing, glorious garments on you, now go out and act like you have the job that you're dressed for. What difference does it make if you think, not because you're so great, but because God can do amazing things with something very small? What difference would it make to you if you realized, if you thought to yourself, you know what I put into this might not be that great, but what God does with it will be amazing. And so this thing will succeed. This thing will bear fruit. What happens when you go out and you say, I should try this, I should do this, because even though it might not look amazing to the world, God can do something great through this. You know what? There's a person out there who's hurting. There's a person out there who feels the same shame and everything that I've felt in my life. And I can go and I can lift them up. And maybe my efforts aren't anything to write home about, but maybe God, through my efforts, can do something amazing. All through the New Testament, when Jesus walks on this earth, you see examples of this. Jesus takes a little boy's lunch and he feeds 5,000 people with it. It wasn't that the little boy's lunch, it wasn't that the little boy came with a food truck. The little boy didn't need a food truck. He just needed to be willing to give to God the little bit that he had, and then to watch God do amazing things with it. But all of this relies on having confidence that if you give up those things that you think are so worthwhile and you give up to God everything in your life, that what he clothes you with is going to be enough. That what he replaces those things with is going to be greater than what you've given up. It doesn't work without faith. See, God created guilt, and God created shame, and God even created Satan, and he allows Satan to do his work. Why? That's an interesting question. Why? In the story of The Edge, the billionaire eventually returns. He eventually makes it back to civilization. And somebody that he had met previously to going on his adventure asks him a question. You see why this billionaire was in this guy's house. The guy had pointed to this ore, and the oar had a panther on one side. And he asked the guy, he said, "What's on the other side of this oar?" And the billionaire knew the answer. He said, "It's a rabbit taking it easy." Why is the rabbit taking it easy? Because he knows he's smarter than the panther. Now, the interesting thing is, he says, "Wow, that's amazing. I can't believe you knew that that was going to be on there." And he said, "Oh, I know a lot of things, but it's useless information. It's just not that great." You know what happens when he comes back? The guy that he met says, "Why is the rabbit taking it easy?" He says this to the billionaire, and the billionaire looks at him and smiles and says, "Because the rabbit knows he's smarter than the panther." You see, it's one thing to know that you can overcome any enemy. It's one thing to know that Jesus is enough. It's one thing to know that before you've been put to any test. It's another thing to have the experience of saying, "I have defeated the enemies that are out there. I have defeated." You know, the interesting thing is when Israel was coming out of Egypt, remember that God parts the Red Sea and the Egyptian army goes through and it's completely wiped out. Most people know that story. Most people don't know the next story, which is that the Amalekites come and attack. Right after that, the Amalekites come and attack. And guess what happens? God doesn't just smash them all to pieces. God says, "Bring some men out, put them in battle gear, and go out there and fight." Why? Because Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And Jesus is calling you into a battle. And Jesus is going to equip you, and Jesus is going to guide you, and Jesus is going to give you strength, and Jesus is going to make your small efforts big efforts, and Jesus is going to do all that. And at the end, when you stand there, you're going to be triumphant over Satan because Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Jesus is not the king of slaves. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and He wants you to be a king on this earth. He wants you to experience the victory of overcoming. He wants you to stand up and be who He's made you to be. He wants you to have the glory that He's made for you. And you can't do that if the enemies are fake. And you can't do that if there aren't any challenges. Jesus doesn't make a Nerf world for Nerf kings. He makes a real world for real kings. How are you going to have faith in Jesus that He's enough to overcome any enemy if you never face an enemy? How will you know that Jesus is enough? How will you know how glorious He is? How will you know what gifts you've been given if you never face anything real? Don't ask for a fake enemy. Ask for a real enemy and trust that He's enough to overcome. Because God has made all these things, and He is the ruler of all these things, and He doesn't make mistakes.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian Church, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.